serious, what's the worst culture shock you've experienced within your own country? Story 1. Once my wife's family got comfortable enough to really be themselves around me. I was raised Irish Catholic, and my family never acknowledged their problems or addressed grievances between each other. They just had another drink and held a grudge for decades, not an exaggeration. My wife's family is very Italian and would scream at each other for 5 minutes and then just resume their lives like nothing had happened. I was afraid to speak for a little while. Story 2. I moved from Utah to a non-Mormon state. When I was 12 and not Mormon, I was shocked hearing kids my age swearing. Even saying something like, "Oh my God," was just mind-blowing to me. Story 3. Moving from NJ to PA, our town had a community day. The wife and I went by and asked how much everything was. When they told us free, not including local artists selling their stuff, or the hot dog vendor, I didn't understand. I replied something like, "Yeah, free, I get it, but how much?" The concept of a town providing something for its residents without charging them was completely foreign to me. Story 4. I married up. My wife's family is wealthy. They think nothing of flying the entire family of 15 people to a week in Hawaii and paying for everything. It's interesting with her behavior. She's worked on it, but she used to just go to the store and buy stuff without looking at the prices. She said she always was like that, and her family growing up as well. That is what struck me, not Hawaii. Story 5. When I joined the Army, all the people I'd ever known were from the Northeast, generally urban. To suddenly be in a basic training company with nothing but Texans, Ohioans, and people from very rural areas acquainted me quickly with how different our sets of assumptions were about how to interact with each other. Edit typo. Story 6. The first time I had dinner with my white boyfriend and his family. They made steak, and it was cooked rare, and I had only ever had steak well done, and it really freaked me out. Edit. A lot of you are very curious if I still ruin my steaks. I promise I don't anymore. My lovely husband has taught me the error of my ways, and I eat it cooked medium now. Story 7. Moved to Texas from an urban city on the East Coast at age 22. I knew maybe 2 people my age who were married. In Texas, I swear to God, 14 of all 22-year-olds are married. By 25, basically everyone is married or engaged. It was shocking having to check people's ring fingers at bars before trying to hit on them. Where I'm from, people don't even think about settling down until 27 to 28, and most marry around 29 to 30. Story 8. I not so. Recently divorced after 20 years of marriage. The shock between what it was like to be single in the 90s versus 2010s was like waking up having been on a time machine blasted centuries forward in time. Edit time frame. Story 9. As an Asian American, I remember feeling like I was in a different country the first time I had dinner over at my white friend's house. First, his parents asked me to call them by their first names, which is unheard of in a Korean household. Second, they all ordered in pizza. My family never ordered food from a restaurant. We only ate out on very special occasions. And third, they all drank milk with their meal. WTF, the first 2 I get, but seriously, drinking milk with dinner was super weird to me. The only time I ever had milk was with my cereal. Story 10. The first time I did a road trip outside of New England, my boyfriend and I were going through a toll plaza somewhere on the way to Georgia. The toll collector greeted us and said, "Thanks, have a good day." Being from the Boston area, this really blew my mind. Story 11. Going through native reservations is always a sobering reflection of our indigenous communities and the laws that made them the way they are. Dirt-broken roads, overgrown fields, people drinking on their front porch, wild dogs, and a big house for the chief. Story 12. I went from conservative charter school to public high school. It was insane how different it was. People dressed more revealing, guys all sag theater pants. Teachers and students cussed. People were open about. It was very different. Story 13. It's a little silly, but pool water up north is always kind of chilly and takes some adjusting to when swimming. Going down south one summer and getting into a warm pool without having to adjust so much was weird. Also, I've rarely seen the PA state flag outside of like school or government buildings here. Meanwhile, the Colorado state flag seems to be everywhere out there. The Denver airport was flooded with flag merch. PA needs a cooler flag. Story 14. Moving from the Midwest to the Bible Belt. I was raised Christian, but it was beyond uncomfortable when my new friends told me I shouldn't be around single men unchaperoned to preserve my emotional purity, or hearing my roommate tell me that my anxiety disorder was because of demonic possession. Edit. I ended up at a Southern Baptist church youth group in rural Tennessee, and that's where I heard all the crazy. Story 15. Here in TX, cops will make you get out of the car, frisk you, search your car, and try to find a reason to arrest you just for going 5 miles per hour over. In New York, we parked illegally and NYPD came out and told us to fucking move. TBH, I was happier to oblige in New York. Story 16. Mine is lame, but I'm from Minnesota, and we drove to SE, Iowa for my cousin-in-law's basketball game. The people there had almost Southern accents. We were only like 6 hours away from where I live, and their accents were completely different, and a Southernish accent in Iowa. Story 17, Michigander transplanted in Appalachian TN. How to learn that slow talk does not necessarily mean stupid, and bless your heart, when spoken by a woman, often means, well, aren't you a dumb? Story 18, I went to college in Maine, and we decided to go hiking in northern Maine. We made it stop at a Walmart in Presque Isle, and a young kid asked if I was a burn victim. I said no, and then he asked why my skin was brown, implying I was burned. That kid never saw a brown person in real life. His mom was embarrassed. I explained that people are different colors. The look on his face was priceless, but I felt awkward. Story 19, went on vacation with the family of a friend of mine. On the surface, both our families are upper middle class and white. However, the difference between Eastern European Jews from New York and Episcopalian WASPs from Canada, I spent the entire weekend hiding from them, yelling at each other for no reason. I was raised where you don't raise your voice unless something is very, very wrong. This was not the case for them. Story 20, Pakistan, cousin marriage. Don't even get me started on this. Pakistanis think it is completely fine to be marrying your cousins. So much so that nearly 70% of the Pakistani public thinks it is completely fine. I mean, wake the up, people. You are having retarded, not using this as an insult, kids who are being born deaf, mute, with extra limbs, with organs not working, and brains the size of sheep's. Wake the up. Story 21, I live in LA. My job has me all over the city and surrounding areas. It's crazy how you could be in a city like Hacienda Heights 1 second with all Chinese billboards, Chinese markets, and 20 minutes later doing a job in East LA. Now every sign is in Spanish. Later, I'm out north of LA, about an hour drive. It's all desert, and it's white people playing country music sitting on a porch. I live in a mostly white suburb with people driving Teslas, etc. Just crazy. When I first moved here, the difference of areas in just a small distance. Story 22. This is more a story of how I culture shock someone else. I went to Puerto Rico recently to help with disaster relief with my church. We had a barrack-style living situation with 30 dudes from all over the states and a couple communal fridges. We like to grill and have beers after work. So one of the fridges was stacked with beers. Of course, being a church group, we didn't overdo it. We were very tame, but a native Puerto Rican old lady, who was also a member of our church and had volunteered to clean the barracks while we were working, almost had an aneurysm when she saw all our beer. She called up local church elders and told them we were living like debauched animals and that we had brought sin to Puerto Rico. She was inconsolable. Apparently, alcohol is frowned upon among older, conservative Puerto Ricans. We didn't get in any trouble, and they told her she wasn't allowed to clean the barracks anymore. Guess she just wasn't used to seeing how much people of Mexican and German descent drink LOL. To be fair, the fridge was absolutely packed with beer, so it did look bad, especially considering the barracks were built inside a former church. But if you did the math, it was only like 3 beers per person. Story 23, I live in a really awesome town in Canada. Mid-small size, gorgeous climate, tons of lakes and outdoor activities, wineries and orchards everywhere. It's like heaven. We live close to the downtown core, which is really convenient for us, but every day we are reminded of our growing homelessness problem. The homeless population is plagued with a lot of mental illness, addiction, and luck in life. It's a shock to leave my comfortable yet modest IMO home and see people, literally a block away, that slept on the street and have to wash in the creek. It's heartbreaking. My mom always used to tell me that homeless people deserved it because they were druggies. No one deserves to sleep on the street. It's awful. Story 24, sort of weird one for me, lol. I'm white, grew up in a typical, mostly white suburban community, but I've spent my past 8 years living in NYC and, more recently, Los Angeles. I live in a middle-class neighborhood in LA, and the only white guy in my group of friends. Parties are always tacos Modelo, which I love. I've gone to friends' family parties a few times too, and it's always a pretty laid-back affair. A few weeks ago, my friend took me with him to his childhood friend's grad party in San Diego. It was a bunch of upper-class white people in a nice house by the beach, all dressed up drinking wine. There was food with vegan gluten-free labels. It was so weird to me seeing the type of culture I grew up with after so long. It made me sort of uncomfortable. Story 25, went to deep southern Louisiana once. Stopped at a gas station. Old lady was yelling at her granddaughter. In French. They weren't from France. They were Cajun. I ended up marrying a Cajun gal. She has relatives that cannot speak English. Story 26, going to my first Catholic Mass with my then GF now wife. As someone who is not religious, the very ceremonious flow made me feel like I was in a cult. Now we're married and it's fine, but it was awkward the first time for me. Story 27, I used to live in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I spent some time in the city and was very aware of drive-by shootings. In 2001, I was living in a rural community in West Michigan and was visiting a neighbor. Before I even identified the sound, I was lying on the living room floor with my infant daughter tucked safely under me. No one bothered to mention that the local gun club was 14 a mile away, and it was opening of Deer Day. Worst culture shock ever. Story 28. I studied ecology and ethical development in Cambodia for 6 months in college as part of my degree in botany. Learned a lot about waste management and recycling, etc. When I got back to the U.S., I jumped straight into a bench internship with an environmentally friendly company, which used so much plastic with so much reckless abandon, I couldn't believe it. Now I walk through a grocery store, and it feels like a minefield. Everything is wrapped in freaking plastic wrap. No wonder it's hot in here. Story 29. The Deep South in the U.S. I traveled a lot around the country and been to 30 states before I spent any sort of time in the panhandle of Florida. I'm from NYC, and it was almost a different country. Definitely true for Florida. The further north you go, the further south you get. Story 30. Moved from the PNW to the small rural Midwest. There was nothing more eye-opening than driving through Kansas with every other billboard being for a church, Bible verses, don't about your child, and strip clubs. Story 31. I grew up in a very woodsy area, and living in a city now amazes me how little people understand nature and how freaked out they get by such minor common things. It is so strange to me. Story 32. Funerals wakes. I come from New England and recently moved to the Midwest. I've never heard of bringing food to a wake or funeral. It's just something we've never done. Apparently the custom here is to bring food to the funeral home for the family, because during the viewing, I've only ever known it to be a wake. The family is at the funeral home for 8 hours or so. Back home, the wake is only a couple of hours, and then we usually go out to eat or back home where people will drop food off. Story 33. At 18, I moved from suburbia in the north of England to the center of London for university. I was used to a lot of greenery, fresh air, friendly neighbors, and safety. I was met with towering concrete and gray and not a breath of fresh air. Everyone was incredibly rude and constantly in a rush. And it was no longer safe to walk around on my own anymore without getting constantly harassed. The underground smelled like sweat and dust. I used to take a bus to Sainsbury's from outside my accommodation. Every single person on the bus was foreign and didn't or wouldn't speak English. They would all stare at me like I didn't belong. One of the men on the bus tried to follow me home. I have never felt so alienated and lonely in a city so very full of people. It was like I was in another country. Story 34. Came from southern state, not at all known for being health conscious. Moved to Colorado near Boulder, and it blew my mind to see so many people out riding their bikes. And they love their dogs so much. Here, dogs are property to be stuck in the backyard to serve as security where I am from. And all the farmers markets and smoking cigarettes is seriously frowned on. I could go on. It is wonderful. I found my people. Story 35. Out west, they don't have sweet tea. Looking at you, California. No, I don't want raspberry tea, not strawberry, not peach. I want got 'em sweet tea. Story 36. Living in Newfoundland. I can go to just about any convenience store and pick up a case of beer. But when I went to Toronto, I went to about 3 or 4 different convenience stores before being told that I needed to go to the beer store to purchase beer. I passed the beer store a couple of times while walking around and assumed it was a store to buy supplies for making your own beer. We have a few of those stores in my city. Story 37. Going to a Ramadan feast and seeing the whole goat in the middle of the table and everyone sitting around it pulling the meat off with their hands. I didn't partake. Story 38. Young people smoking. As a fellow kid, I grew up with this ingrained notion that smoking was a crime punishable by death. When I moved to college town, I was immediately shocked to see the gathering of young 20-something college students having a discussion about Chaucer, or some such, I assume, and each of them smoking a cigarette. Story 39. Driving down the west coast of the U.S. and stopped in Oregon for gas. Got out to pump my gas and was accosted by a crazy attendant yelling that I was breaking the law. And to get back in my car, I was shocked to find out it is indeed illegal to pump your own gas in Oregon. Story 40. Grew up East Coast. Went to college deep in the Midwest for 5 years, tri-state area of OH, KY, and IN. Left with a far less optimistic view of America. Did not gel at all with the Midwest nice culture. Got told a few times to go back to your country. Frankly, people were super religious, kind of dumb, and not very interesting. The opiates are a huge problem, and it felt like everybody was doing them, but the food beer was pretty good. Story 41. When my wife, then girlfriend, moved from the Boston area down to Kansas to live with me. Watching her struggle with the difference was really funny. I can't tell you how many times she mentioned how much nicer and friendlier everyone is, how people will just smile and say hi on the street, and they aren't up to something. Also, how it's not the racist, homophobic place that the East Coast tends to think of all the flyover states, Recently, her mother and brother have moved to Kansas as well, and watching them go through the same culture shock. Story 42. I moved from a small town in Ohio to Miami, Florida. I live in Little Havana where the majority of people are Cuban, signs are in Spanish, and most people speak Spanish or are bilingual. The amount of fruit trees were unfamiliar to me. Also, the heat and rainy season, not to mention traffic. Story 43. I grew up poor to lower middle class. My mom eventually started working for hospital in charts, and she was responsible for the plastic surgeons. One of them real nice guy invited everyone to his yearly Christmas parties. Nice thanks for coming, gift bags, etc. I'd been at his house for something early in that year, and he had this new piece of modern art, concrete tagged, painted shoes. It was like a small section of my reality hanging in this postmodern very nice house. Christmas party that year. In wallflowering, because I have like zero in common with most of the folks there, he takes me into the kitchen and introduces me to this lady. At first, I kind of thought he was introducing me to the chef, because I like to cook, and we had some conversations about barbecue. Turns out she was the artist that made the piece I liked on the wall. Up until that point, art to me was far away behind rope walls and in museums or things painted up on walls in the dead of night looking out for cops. I knew artists existed, obviously, but these weren't people you met and talked to and shared hummus with, or stop by your Christmas party and give a talk about their own art. Story 44, that some people eat salty toe for dessert instead of sweet one, and that some people are not afraid of cockroach because they have never seen southern cockroach, which are as big as a person's thumb. By the way, I am from China. Story 45, born and raised on the West Coast, USA. When I turned 19, moved to Tennessee smack dab in the middle of the Bible Belt. To say it was a shock is an understatement. I was a stoner skater with long hair and completely different speech and mannerisms, but thankfully people down there were like, whoa, that dude is so chill, rather than who the is this guy. Story 46, how common casual and hookups are. American Samoa, a university student in a committed relationship, all of my friends hooking up with each other and strangers baffles me. Story 47, moved to the NYC area from Arizona a couple years ago when I was 26. It was weird seeing how much people actually care about where your family came from. Like Italian families actually prefer that you are with other Italians in relationships. When I went to my Italian girlfriend's sister's wedding, her dad would introduce me to their family members and say, don't worry, he has a nice Italian last name, Wa Papioni. I didn't think about it at first, but he was afraid they wouldn't like me because I don't look Italian, so he made sure they knew I was at least part Italian. Where I'm from, no one gave a who you were with or where your family originated from generations ago. It also surprised me that there's so much racism in New York. I thought it would be much more progressive than Arizona, but it sure as didn't feel that way. I hear people using racial slurs fairly often, very surprising. Honestly, I never heard any racism in Arizona, but I hear it occasionally in New York. Story 48, a couple, but coasting through high school and then hitting college thinking I had the world on easy mode. No, see, you had to go to classes and read the textbooks there, flunked out in a few semesters. Story 49, I got pulled out of work because my then wife was in the hospital. She was 8 months pregnant. I was on active duty, so I was in uniform. Someone spit on me on my way into the hospital. Fuck you for your service. This was 2011. Story 50, I don't know if this is fair since it's reverse culture shock, but I was living in Japan for just over 3 years and only came back to the mainland US for one visit the whole time. Whenever ID lived in Japan before I traveled back a lot. So I was never away for long. This time was different. I moved home at the tail end of 2016, and I was honestly shocked at how authoritarian the U.S. is. Japan is hierarchical in some ways, but the overall feeling I got was that people were comparatively equal in their standing in the U.S., though all I saw when I got back was this fetishization of power cops, military, Trump, managers, masters, basically, know your betters, stay in your place. It was really creepy. I've become inured to it again, but I bet if I move back to Japan for any length of time, fingers crossed, I'll feel it again. Story 51, I'm studying in France, but am Indian, went back to India after nearly 18 months in January this year. Landed early morning and booked a car to my city. 2 hours later, after we left the highway to enter the city, I was scared of people cutting across our lane and coming from all directions, and I wasn't even driving. This was after spending 22 years in the city and being part of that traffic. Story 52, I wouldn't call this worse per se, but it came to mind. When I moved to AZ from New York, I was totally shocked that motorcyclists didn't have to wear helmets. Then I moved to OH and realized it's pretty much the norm in the US. I still think it's stupid not to wear one, though. Story 53, I grew up in rural Iowa. My family was above average in wealth for my town, but we still didn't have a lot. We almost never ate out and did our best to conserve money. When I went to college, I started dating a girl from the Chicago area. Over winter break, I went to visit her and meet her family. That's when I found out her dad owned a law firm and made a seven-figure income. They were so wasteful, they never cooked and refused to drink any water that didn't come out of a Fiji water bottle. Also, her 16-year-old brother drove a brand new Mercedes, and her dad got a new Porsche every year. Story 54, the Trump presidency after the civil rights movement of the 60s. I believed racism was on the decline and tolerance was increasing now. With the racist in chief in power, the rest of them are coming out of the shadows and shouting their hate. Story 55, going to an Irish bar before a New York Rangers game. Was meeting a bunch of my fellow law enforcement friends. Looked for them, couldn't find them, and one texted me that they all went next door because one of said friends was refused entry because he was black. Now, they didn't specifically say anything so bold as, hey, your kind isn't welcome here, but they gave him such a hard time with checking his ID, asking if he was carrying his firearm, etc. And meanwhile, another friend's blonde, hair blue-eyed daughter who could pass for younger than 21 waltzed in, no questions asked. This was the first time that I saw someone I knew be discriminated against in such a way. And in New York City of all places, where you'd think people would be much more accepting, and it didn't help that I'm Irish myself. And in that moment, I was quite ashamed of my people. Story 56, driving from MI to FL and passing through another state to gas up, where I read a sign that said we have the right to refuse service to anyone of color. It blew my mind. Story 57, going to Portland for part of my honeymoon. I am from Idaho. And while we have homeless people here, there were homeless people everywhere we went in Portland. It really made me struggle with why I was feeling uncomfortable being around them. It was because I wasn't used to seeing so many people in need and my own stereotypes of those people. I struggled with just smiling at these people. I now try really hard to help those in need at home. Because of this experience, it really is shocking to go to maybe seeing one or two panhandlers in the typical places to a lot more people on the sidewalks and in parks everywhere. Story 58, Baltimore, Maryland. I had a family member go to Johns Hopkins for a complicated surgery, and much of the staff was black and really rude to the white people in my family. They were okay to the rest of us. And from the South, where racism is supposedly just terrible, but we're all really nice, polite to each other. The venom was palpable, and we were all shocked. We all came away thinking Yankees are a hell of a lot more racist than Southerners. Story 59, the first time I visited an isolated Northern Reserve in Canada. I'm from rural Canada, small town, etc. We have a ton of indigenous folks in town. So that wasn't the culture shock. It was seeing how we let people live. No running water, no health care, no houses for some people, no electricity or Wi-Fi. It was just a lot of thawing mud and people trying to survive. Too poor to move, corrupt band leader. Once they do move, they face constant racism in urban areas. It was really sad. I've never cried so much in my whole life. Obviously, not all reserves are like that. But this one is particularly bad and has actually declared a state of emergency several times. It's such a contrast from reserves in some places like BC, where the reserve land is actually part of or close to a major city. Story 60, I don't drink. In New Zealand, everyone drinks. Visiting friends, I would get offered alcohol, and they would be offended when I didn't accept it. People who knew me would understand, but strangers tended to get forceful about it, saying things like in my house, you drink before offering it to me again. I don't like the taste of alcoholic drinks, and I don't like the feeling of being drunk or tipsy. Only times I ever drank was that one time to see what it's like, and when people forced me to afterwards. Story 61, I'm from the northern Midwest, and my family and I drove down to Florida in 2016. We stopped at a gas station in Atlanta, Georgia. My older cousin and I went in to go to the bathroom, and the African-American cashier yelled at us to get out and that they don't serve white people. We were so shocked we just left quickly and not even mad. I'm sure there are a lot of racist people still, but I've never actually seen discrimination in action. So sad. Story 62, visiting NYC. My first vacation with my sister was to DC, but I took a day trip to NYC because I wanted to see the Lion King and Broadway. I had never been to a city bigger than Oklahoma City. NYC was awful. It was so stressful. My sister and I decided to skip dinner so we could hide in the train station to go back to DC. ETA, now that I'm on a PC, let me explain more. I spent 7 days in DC and about 8 hours in NYC. 3 of those hours were spent seeing Lion King. 1 hour was spent eating lunch. I felt more unsafe and stressed during those 8 hours than I did during my entire trip to DC combined. NYC packed full of people. Filthy subway system. We only saw the part connected to the Amtrak station. People trying to sell you touristy on every corner. People asking for money in every doorway. Cars for some unfathomable reason trying to actually drive on these streets. Why does anyone try to drive there? People trying to get you to sign things colder than it should be because of the building's constant shade. People trying to sell you CDs. No place to stand without being harassed, trying To cross streets was a mess, and I think that is it. Granted, all of time was spent around Times Square, but again, worst 8 hours ever. Story 63, I moved from one of the most diverse cities in California to a small podunk town in East Texas for a year. It was a sundown town, which means people of color couldn't cross the train tracks into a certain part of town at night, or they'd be arrested by the local cops. This was in 2004. Story 64, my school is in a not very good area. I was very shocked when I found out a few months ago that other schools don't have fights often, as in daily or weekly. I was also shocked when I found out that drugs and crime in general aren't as common in kids in other areas. I still don't believe it, to be honest. It's hard to think of my life with less bad things around me. Maybe it would be better, who knows? Story 65, I live in the South. I moved from the biggest city in my state to its second biggest, and it was like I moved to a different world for the first time. Coworkers seemed uncomfortable when I talked about my boyfriend, who I've lived with for many years. People keep religious posters in their workspaces. People have strong opinions on gambling, which I've barely even thought of before, because who the gambles anymore? People lose custody of their children for cohabitation as a matter of course. If I became pregnant, I would have to travel hours on multiple occasions to get a safe and legal abortion. Though, like most people I've met, have been different but still kind, and there's still corporeal punishment in nearby schools. Story 66, I think the first time I visited one of my friends who was very poor, it was startling how bare everything was and how nervous she was to offer me a snack. She was afraid her dad would get mad at her for sharing. It was also my first look at how alcoholism affects families. My family was lower middle class, sometimes bordering on lower class, so it's not like I was coming from a totally different world. We went without a lot of things too, but seeing below-the-line poverty on such a personal level was shocking to third-grade me. Story 67, my family were kind of nomads when I was a child up until I was about 13, but for the most part, we had lived on Indian reservations because my ma worked for Indian Health Service. We had lived on the Paiute, Crow Creek, Standing Rock reservations, just to name a few. Point being that we were almost always around other natives, and as a result of that, my siblings and I were kind of used to the blatant racism from Caucasian people that occurs in these kind of places. Growing up, it was just sort of normal to see people treat my ma horribly at the store just because she was native, or to hear things like prairie redskin or drunk Indian on a pretty regular basis. After a while, it's just to be expected. Anyway, when I was about 17, my dad was out of prison and was living with his family down in Wisconsin, so I went to go spend some time with him and try to establish a relationship with him. I lived and worked at the Dells tourist town, and man, I don't know if it was just being that age or what, but being down there was one of the best times of my life. It was seriously one of the first times I remember people treating me like just another person instead of a native. People were always so friendly and helpful whenever I needed help or whatever. The friends I made were some of the best friendships I had ever experienced. I didn't experience racism once while I was there, which was roughly a year and a half. Just nothing but acceptance and friendship. It was amazing. I have never experienced anything like that since. I'm sure I would if I end up moving someplace where there isn't a lot of natives, which sucks to say, but it's true even where I've lived recently in Fargo, North Dakota. It's a bit better, but mainly because there aren't too many natives, and the racism is aimed at the African population. They get the blatant racism, while every other ethnic group gets the quiet racism. You know, the racism that only rears its head when they're drunk or think there aren't any other races around. So yeah, that was a trip. Story 68, we were in Texas visiting and decided to order a taco pizza from Pizza Hut. We figured that being a Tex-Mex state, they would have the best. Turns out, they've never heard of taco pizza and had no idea what we were talking about. Also, all the Hispanics and signage in both Spanish, English, and music blaring in both languages in malls, and that everyone wears cowboy boots as every day, where we felt like we had walked through a door to another country. Story 69, I had one beer Stella Artois. So not even a heavy beer over the course of a 4-hour meal, conversation, etc., with a group of Mormons. At the end of the meal, one of them, very seriously, asked me if I was okay to drive, or if I needed a ride home. They spend no time around people who drink, so they have no concept of intoxication. I appreciate the offer, but I might have laughed a little too loud, because she blushed pretty hard. I explained to her that even a toddler would be sober having one beer 4 hours previous. Story 70, having to hand my credit card over to some crusty old guy in Oregon so he could pump my gas for me and ring it up at the pump because the younger cashier didn't know how to work the register. It was unsettling. Story 71, I'm from Argentina. I live in the capital, but went to the north to visit my cousin as a kid. I was very used to MC Donald's, but there was nothing like it up there. They keep it this way, so local business can survive. All his friends were amazed I was from the capital and that I knew a bit of English. They asked me to say Dexter's Laboratory out loud. Also, everything is closed from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. for siesta law. Everything opens till 10 p.m. for the same reason. Story 72 in a few hours' time. I went from my right-leaning, mid-sized hometown to my liberal arts college full of very liberal students to a backcountry cookout campfire situation with some very rural, very conservative good old boys. I traveled through the entire political spectrum in about 6 hours. Story 73, my first significant travel out of state was to a state where it was still permitted to smoke in restaurants. I literally stopped dead on entering one before I figured out what was going on. Story 74, Canadians are known to be polite, but after living in Japan for a year, came back and was shocked by how rude everyone was, especially in customer service. One of the first things I did after getting back was buy coffee, and the cashier mumbled when she spoke to me, didn't make eye contact, didn't smile at all. I was shocked and offended, but later realized it was because I was just used to the extremely polite service in Japan and dialed down my expectations.